Welcome to our MNU Stories presented by the MNU Student Counseling and Wellness Office in partnership with Resilience Through Stories series. This series has been a year-long effort coordinated by Addison Lucci, our MNU librarian, and this is also in partnership with Humanities Kansas. Throughout this year, Addison has invited people from the community to come and explore how stories can help people cope with adverse life events and overcoming challenges. And so how appropriate for this series to happen this year. Little did we know we were all preparing ourselves for one of the biggest challenges our world has faced in decades. So for today, we thought we would reflect on what we've learned and this year and how we might use those overarching themes that we heard this year to apply to our lives in the middle of this coronavirus. So welcome, Addison.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. And yeah, I agree that this is a theme that's especially relevant at present during a time like this one.
Right. First, Addison, I think it'd be great if you give our listeners an overview of some of the speakers that you brought in this year for the Resilience Through Story series.
Certainly. We started the year out with a panel discussion on the topic Resilience Through Story, which I guess you know because you yourself moderated. But in that panel discussion, there were 4 humanities scholars and storytellers from the surrounding area who discussed how learning stories, how they work, and how to create them can help to transfer a storyteller's sense of narrative progression in individuals into our own methods of coping with life changes and trauma. So specifically, the scholars we worked with most were Bryn Fitzsimmons, who is a PhD student in English, Miguel Flores, who is a poet and children's book author, and Daniel Schwabauer, who's an award-winning novelist, as well as LaDonna McCulloch, who our own expert on intercultural engagement. Then after that initial panel discussion with everyone, we had a series of smaller workshops and events throughout the year. So there was a session by Bryn on game-based storytelling. Miguel Flores taught a poetry writing workshop, talking about how to process difficult topics through poetry as a language. Dan Schwabauer shared a lecture on the language of story. We hosted an African-American read-in, a film screening, and then concluded with an event from the poet laureate of Kansas, Huascar Medina, in a poetry reading from our community. So awesome. A variety of community events and some book discussions as well that were held in collaboration with the Olathe Public Library.
It's awesome. So when you think about all that you witnessed this year and all that you heard this year, Addison, were there words or key phrases or main ideas that seem to appear over and over in regards to like resilience?
Yeah, there were definitely key phrases and words, a couple common themes, I would say, overall from these speakers. So I'll speak to 3 of them at least. One of them was that many of these speakers and events tied stories and storytelling back to personal development and identity development. So how seeing your life as a narrative can help to promote a sense of connectedness, wellness, and resilience. So different events looked at this idea in different ways, obviously, but some on the psychology of how stories work in our brains, some on how writing and sharing our stories helped us to process traumatic events, and some how stories can help us to connect with other people relationally. Several speakers in this way connected to the idea of narrative theory, which is a theory that varies in its particular scope, but at its heart states that stories are one of the fundamental ways through which we as people see the world, arrange life events, and then understand ourselves and other people. So that's one. I would say a second theme would be based on the functions of fairy or fantasy stories as shared by Tolkien in his essay on fairy stories. So these were brought up multiple times, but what Tolkien says the functions of stories are, or of fantasy stories, are recovery, escape, and consolation. So in this case, recovery refers to stories' ability to help us to recognize what really matters. That there is more to life than what we usually see in the day-to-day, and that stories can actually to help us remember what is most real, what is most often hidden in our day-to-day lives. So that way they can kind of help us to clear the lenses through which we see the world. And then escape, in this case, refers to stories' ability to not to distract us from what is real in that sense of negative escapism, but actually to provide us with tools, ideas, and ways of thinking that'll help us when we emerge back into the real world. And then the third thing Tolkien talks about is consolation, which refers to stories' ability to restore our hope and faith in beauty and truth and goodness, which relates to our ability as Christians to remember that there is a coming fulfillment, a time when everything will be made new. And just really briefly, a third theme I'd say from the talks as a whole would relate to the idea that we often tell ourselves stories in our minds that perhaps are not true, or perhaps that are just limited in scope, that there can actually be a danger in believing the single stories, to borrow a term, that we tell ourselves in our minds, and that recognizing that different people have their own stories or ways of seeing or understanding certain events or issues can be very helpful.
Right.
And that's actually one thing to add to that is that's not saying that truth is subjective, but rather that we often tell ourselves that our own truths are objective when they're not. So stories can help us point us closer to Christ, who is the truth, and in that way serve as signposts to truth. And truth itself does bring healing.
That's right. That's great. I can see how everything you just said can apply to where we are right now, especially in our isolation, when you talk about how these stories can help bring meaning even in this time. One of the, some of the speakers I know spoke about loss. And do you believe that stories of loss, in my opinion, seem to often evolve into stories of growth? And of course, I'm thinking about all the loss that people are having right now with this coronavirus. Can you give me some examples of stories that might be encouraging for us right now in terms of loss that evolves into growth?
Yeah, so I'll try to think of specific stories. It may have something, but in terms of that concept, that I do believe that the greatest potential for growth does come from times of struggle and loss. I think even like the academic concepts like a growth mindset refer to this, that it's our times of greatest struggle and loss and failure that can provide the greatest opportunity for growth. I do also think it's important to note too that oftentimes resilience itself isn't about overcoming challenges and growing, but in many cases, perhaps even for many in the midst of our present situation, it's resilience simply means coping or making it through the difficulties, sorrows, and losses, which is still equally important.
Absolutely.
But I would say that personal and spiritual growth does often occur through loss, because loss and suffering change us as people. They can increase our empathy and actually they can negatively or positively affect the way we see the world. But when we process it, voice it, and actually fit it into our life stories or narratives, it's more often to have a positive effect. So I do have a couple more thoughts on that, if that's okay.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
So seeing loss as an opportunity for growth, I think, is challenging because we don't like to lose things as people.
Right.
But particularly in the case of the COVID-19 virus, people are losing things that are incredibly difficult to lose. Many of us are losing jobs or temporarily losing communities, and even more than that, at times, relationships or even people. I guess thinking of a story from my own life that is relevant to that theme a little bit. My father passed away when I was very young. Like I wouldn't look back on that event and say that it's positive or I'm glad that it happened. But then at the same time, I can reframe that event narratively in my mind and kind of fit it into the story of my life instead of keeping it isolated or undealt with. So I recognize that it's traumatic and a horrible thing that I'll never see my dad again on this earth. But at the same time, I can recognize that from that trauma, I was able to grow into a person that I would not have been able to if not because of that loss.
Right.
So in that way, it's changed me personally, but also helped me in the way I can relate to and approach to others who've gone through similar losses.
Yeah, right. That's good. So Addison, from all this experience of that you've had this year with the Resilience Through Stories series, and then also just as a librarian, are there books that you can recommend to us right now that would be good stories, good examples of maybe resilience or like you said, just coping during this time to just give us hope?
So I'll mention some that speak specifically to the resilience theme, which are the books that we use as a part of the book discussion component of the event, but then some other personal recommendations too. So the ones we used were A Monster Calls, which is a book by Patrick Ness, which kind of describes the story of loss and hope in the midst of it through a child's grief and his struggle in the midst of emotional turmoil. Then Persepolis, which is by Marjane Satrapi, It just demonstrates the main character's tendency to reframe her narrative based on new information as she receives it, which impacts her as a person. The Hate You Give, which is by Angie Thomas, which explores Star, the protagonist's life in the aftermath of her friend's death. And then the fourth one we used is Night, which is a memoir by L.A. Wiesel, which recounts the author's early life in Nazi Germany. And that's a good example of how he kind of talks about, it's an example of how resilience sometimes means, I guess, survival, or not necessarily triumph, but then personally making it through.
Yeah.
And then just as a book lover and librarian myself, then I would also recommend Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl.
Yes, love that book.
Yes, it's fantastic, and a great example of hope in the midst of trials. The Book Thief by Marcus Zuzak is another great one. And then as personal favorites, either the Narnia series or the Lord of the Rings series by J.R.R. Tolkien as great examples of the recovery and consolation that storytelling can provide.
That's great. I love all of those. Last October, Bryn Fitzsimmons, you mentioned her earlier, she presented a seminar on story-based games and how in some ways they can be an outlet for sharing our own stories. So can you share with us what you remember from that seminar, and then maybe games that she believed would fit into this category of storytelling that might be helpful for us? We have time now maybe to play more games.
Yes. And Bryn's workshop was fantastic, and she had a whole bunch to say on using story-based games to build resilience. So she talked both about stories themselves, games, and then used examples of those story-based games as avenues for building resilience and coping with life challenges. And to do that, she actually is one of the ones who used Tolkien's model of escape, recovery, and consolation. Specifically, she used the game Once Upon a Time as one, and also Rory Story Cubes. Both of those involve collaborative storytelling together, and then she kind of drew through debriefings themes based on that. And some other games are Snake Oil, Dixit, Concept, which are all great games. We actually have them at MNU in our Center for Games and Learning as well. People can kind of rent those.
Maybe next fall, right?
Maybe next fall once we're open again. Yeah, so games are a great avenue for building resilience and those kinds of things. Bryn actually leads an outreach to the Juvenile Detention Center here in Johnson County. And teaches the kids how to apply concepts of stories through games like disasters and dilemmas and story goals and such. Yeah, I think games or role play, all of that are great ways for people to process, learn, and grow in a safe and relational game-based context.
That's great. Maybe something to consider while we're spending this time at home.
Yes.
Throughout the year, you not only talked about story, but you had people come in and talk about drawing and painting and poetry and photography, how they can all play into telling our stories. How could we incorporate those now, Addison, during this time?
Yeah. Yes, so there were the various art exhibitions we had and artist talks relating to the theme of visual storytelling, and they weren't particularly Humanities Kansas sponsored events, but we decided to tie them into the same theme.
Sure.
Anyways. So there are a couple different themes that were discussed through those talks. One that came up was how beauty often emerges from sadness. Somebody actually spoke on beauty within imperfection and those kinds of things. I think that in this time of change, isolation, and loss, we can take those ideas to heart, recognizing what we're going through, but also how we can use this as an opportunity to create and share beauty with the world. So that would be one. And that's also tying back to the idea that we're all creative beings, which was also discussed, even if we don't necessarily create art or those kinds of things. One of the artists actually was a photographer who captured, Sharon Rodriguez, who captured photographers of the homeless. So she works with those people to write and share their stories, which is really cool. It's an example, I guess, of how art can be used as in a very real way, used to share, provide a voice for the voiceless, I guess I would say.
Right.
So other thoughts on that? I guess during the COVID-19 isolation, we could consider ways that we can actually more fully serve and love the people and communities around us too. Without a physical presence, I think serving and loving people has to be a lot more intentional. But perhaps it'll help us to value people in our communities even more afterwards too. So in terms of relating this back to painting and such, while paintings, poetry, and photography are beautiful forms of self-expression and creativity, I think just loving and serving in the various occupations and work and communities and callings we've been placed in also are. So we're all creative beings in that way and have the opportunity to create beauty through our words and through our actions and through the stories that we do tell with our lives.
Right.
So I liked how those artists kind of applied that to everybody's, all of our day-to-day lives.
Yeah, I love that. So Addison, in closing, can you share what you are personally doing during this time of uncertainty to either build your own resiliency or live within it at this, kind of crazy time that we're all living in?
Yeah. So like many people, I think right now, I'm currently kind of forced to be resilient because as my work's become almost entirely online and in those kinds of things and studies. But it's been a good experience at the same time and sometimes has actually forced me into being more productive. So I've already created so many digital research tutorials I wouldn't have even gotten to without the motivation, I guess.
Right.
But I think also much of what I am doing now takes intentionality too. For me, it is important to be engaged in stories, especially personally speculative literature, which would be stories of other worlds, fantasy, and those kinds of things for that sense of recovery. And I found that even setting aside 30 minutes of my day to read a few chapters of a novel has a huge effect on me in terms of refocusing into what matters. I've also found it important to keep rhythms present in my life. I would say like liturgies of life in that way. So just like regular prayer and time for reflection, going on walks in nature are all important for me to focus myself, not only in my day-to-day life and personal narrative, but then also just on the greater narrative that I'm placed within. So acknowledging that there's a bigger story than my own, that there's a great storyteller who is our God as well, and remembering that we have our own parts to play within that.
Yeah, that is wonderful.
And actually, I do have one more additional thought, if that's all right, based on a question that I was asked recently. Somebody asked me how I think future generations may respond to the stories that we tell them about this situation that we're currently in. When we tell them our stories about living through this time, how others will respond. So I was just think it's relevant to share that thought with you. But my thought is that, first of all, research shows that one of the best predictors of what will make somebody a good parent is not their circumstances, but rather their own ability to make sense of their own life stories. It's hard to predict for me how future generations will respond to our stories about this situation, but I do believe that the response depends upon the telling. So it's important for us currently to be resilient as we respond to the events that we're going through, as we seek to make sense of our stories in light of the greater biblical narrative of which we're a part. So this is a time of changes and anxieties and losses, but it's also a time in which Christ is still fully present with us, in a time in which we're forced to rely upon him alone as our comfort and as our anchor. So I don't know how future generations will respond to the stories we tell them about the pandemic, but I hope that the stories we do tell them fully reflect both the challenges we face, the resilience of many of our communities, but also the presence and grace of our God in the midst of it all. So obviously, again, he's a great storyteller, and I'm looking forward to seeing more of the stories that he's telling and how the seeds he's planting will be transformed into something beautiful, both within us and within generations.
Great. That is wonderful, Addison. Thank you so much for sharing with us today. And I so appreciate all you did this year. It definitely made a difference for many people. And I feel like it just encouraged us, and maybe that was piece of the puzzle to prepare us for now. So thank you for doing that.
Yeah, thank you too for the opportunity to share. I enjoyed it.
All right. Goodbye.
Bye.